Emma could not feel a doubt of having given Harriet's fancy a proper direction and raised the gratitude of her young vanity to a very good purpose. I'm Ellen.
And I'm Harriet, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're looking at chapters 6 to 10 of Emma. And it's your turn to go first with the 100-word summary.
Okay, well, this is what I've got. Emma is determined that Mr. Elton and Harriet will make a match, and feels it is going well when he's enthusiastic about her portrait of Harriet. Mr. Martin writes a proposal to Harriet, and Emma convinces her to decline. Mr. Knightley is angry and tells Emma she has done badly by Harriet. Harriet is collecting riddles, and Mr. Elton contributes a charade for which the answer is courtship. Emma and Harriet pay a visit to a poor family, and on the way back run into Mr. Elton. Emma contrives things so that they are invited into the vicarage.
Well, you managed to say all that beautifully in nice, simple language. I've left out half of it. But anyway, I got it down to 100. Emma, not aware who his real object is, tries to promote a match between Mr. Elton and Harriet, first by asking his encouragement for the portrait of Harriet she is painting, and then for a contribution to Harriet's riddle collection. She is perturbed when Harriet seems inclined to accept a proposal from the farmer Robert Martin, but induces her to refuse him. Mr. Knightley then warns her that she is injuring Harriet's future, and that Elton wants a richer wife. Emma reflects on her obligations to the poor, but is distracted by the chance of seeing inside the vicarage.
Well, you did cover some points I missed, like the reference to the poor.
One of the things I want to be able to pick out as we go through are the hints that Jane Austen is giving us about the blunders. What are we meant to know at each section of the book? At what point is she telling us that Emma is being absolutely stupid and that Mr. Elton has revealed without a doubt who he's really interested in?
Well, I think we're getting that in chapter 6. Because one of the bits I highlighted is he's saying things like, is not this room rich in specimens of your landscape and flowers, and has not Mrs. Weston some inimitable figure pieces in her drawing room at Randall's?
Yeah.
And then you have, yes, good man, thought Emma, but what has all this to do with taking likenesses? You know nothing of drawing. Don't pretend to be in raptures about mine. Keep your raptures for Harriet's face. Yeah, it's really obvious on a second time through, but I think even on a first time through, it would start to raise some suspicions that Emma is 100% wrong.
Yes, and then by the time you get to chapter 9, it's just so obvious.
Yes.
How could she be so stupid?
It's not even that she's being stupid, it's that she's got this idea in her head.
Yes.
And she's just seeing everything influenced by this idea she's got in her head.
Do we also see what Mr. Knightley thinks of Emma? Do we see Emma's subconscious connection to Mr. Knightley?
Well, I think I got this from John Mullen, that Jane Austen is giving us these obvious clues about Mr. Elton so we can pick up on these clues and think, aren't I cleverer than Emma? I've worked this out.
Yeah.
But because of that, we miss the more subtle clues about Knightley, and even more so when Frank and Jane come on the scene.
And also giving us the idea that this is not a book with mysteries in it that will be revealed.
Yeah.
This is one where you sit there and you think, oh, poor silly Emma.
Yes.
Why doesn't she see it? How completely Emma is fooling herself.
Yeah. But of course, the other big thing we get, and again it's about Emma in chapter 6, is the stuff about her painting. She's got all these unfinished artworks, and she is actually moderately critical of herself, but she wants other people to admire them. And I particularly like the bit where she's talking about one she took of the baby, and she thinks it is as strong a likeness of his cockade as you would wish to see. And then she goes on to say, the corner of the sofa is very good. She's pointing to all the unimportant bits that she says are good. And of course, what she's hoping is that Harriet will say, and Mr. Elton will say, oh no, and it's a beautiful likeness of the baby.
Yes.
She's quite happy to receive other people's praise, even though she knows she doesn't really deserve it.
Yes, and there's another thing about that passage that I find fascinating because it's got this sort of somehow a woman of the world. It could be sort of Mary Crawford.
Yes.
She does a sort of leader of society way
Yeah.
of talking.
Mm.
And she does it with confidence and it's entertaining.
Yeah.
I mean, she's just as entertaining as Mary Crawford.
Mm. And of course, the other thing I love about it is when she's finished the painting of Harriet, everyone's different reactions with
Yes.
Mr. Elton just gushing over it in a really...
without looking at it properly.
And then Mr. Woodhouse being all, oh, but she should be wearing a shawl because she's sitting outside.
Yes.
But then I also really love, you have made her too tall, Emma, said Mr. Knightley.
I love it, yes.
Yes, he's kind of undercutting her, and Emma knows that she'd made her too tall and she's not going to admit to it.
It's just one move in that fencing they're always having with one another.
Yeah.
I've started to realise her incredible ability to make so much happen in one scene. What we've got here is this sort of comic scene. They're entertaining on the surface, but they've got all these characters going through it. Each time anyone speaks, a tiny little bit of extra information about them is added. No authorial comment. It's just this wonderful ability to get so much into what looks like a simple little piece of narration, or at the most a nice little comic scene. And yet you're building up yourself all this information, and which is why one can reread them. You know, you don't need the mystery in Emma. That's not the reason you read it, so you don't in the least mind reading it again.
The next chapter, chapter 7, this is Mr. Martin's proposal, and this I think is possibly Emma in her worst light. This is deliberate and planned and manipulative and really horrible.
This could really ruin Harriet's life.
But having said that, if you kind of step back, her manipulation of Harriet is masterly.
Oh, isn't it? Well, look, she's had so much training since she was a little girl. Everyone around her has been sort of manipulating Mr. Woodhouse. So she's had all the training in the world to do it. And, of course, what she doesn't realise is Harriet possibly is more in love with Mr. Martin than she ever becomes with Mr. Elton. Mr. Elton just has this glamour.
I think you are meant to think that Harriet is possibly slightly shallow in her emotions, but she definitely has more depth and always has had more depth of feeling for Mr. Martin than Emma realised and than she had for Mr. Elton and probably also than she had for Mr. Knightley.
All the feeling she's had from Mr. Elton is what Emma's told her he's been feeling.
So then, in chapter 8, we have the conversation between Mr. Knightley and Emma about Mr. Martin and Harriet.
And this is where we just get the wonderful, deep kindness and commitment and strength of Mr. Knightley. His commitment to other people. He really cares about Robert Martin, but he also cares about Harriet. He's saying to Emma, you know, you're ruining this girl's life. And again, you know, what you get to feel is Emma doesn't really know what she's talking about. This is semi-fantasy.
But she's not 100% wrong, because she says that I'm very much mistaken if your sex in general would not think such beauty and such temper the highest claims a woman could possess. And Mr. Knightley a bit later on says, men of sense, whatever you may choose to say, do not want silly wives. Even in this book, Mr. Knightley's own brother is married to a woman who is, let's be honest, not all that clever. Isabella is really sweet. So John Knightley is probably going to be happier with Isabella than, say, Mr. Bennet is with Mrs. Bennet, or Mr. Palmer is with Mrs. Palmer. It's probably going to be more along the lines of Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram. But, you know, all these cases after cases after cases of Jane Austen giving us men of sense married to very silly but very pretty women. So Emma is actually right in this part of the conversation. But the other thing is, at this point, Emma is the one who tries to wind up the argument, because she says, We think so very differently on this point, Mr. Knightley, that there can be no use in canvassing it. We shall only be making each other more angry. So Emma is actually being the more level-headed one here. And this is a pattern we see several times throughout the book. Because we saw it in the earlier chapter when Mr. Knightley was saying, of course you didn't make the match. And Emma was saying, well, there is a middle ground between just wanting it or actually doing stuff. And then, of course, later on when they're talking about Frank Churchill and he's very anti, so she goes the extreme, is very positive, and then she's the one who says, well, we're both prejudiced, you against, I for. So in some cases like this, she is the bigger person than Mr. Knightley. Now, the other thing about this chapter, and as I said before, I've never liked Emma the character because I thought she was so snobby and so conceited and so sure of herself. But at the end of this chapter, we actually see that she's not always sure of herself because it says Emma remained in a state of vexation too, but there was more indistinctness in the causes of hers than in his. She did not always feel so absolutely satisfied with herself, so entirely convinced that her opinions were right and her adversaries wrong as Mr. Knightley. So again, that's actually speaking better of her than of him. He walked off in more complete self-approbation than he left for her. Coming out of that argument, while he is more right than she is, I think their level of self-satisfaction at the end, I would have more respect for her than for him.
The other thing, I suppose, that I think comes into his character, the position he's in, he's continually got to make these sort of judgments.
Yeah.
And he has to make them as a landlord, he has to make them as a member of the parish council, he has to make them as a magistrate.
Yeah.
He's had a long history of having to do this.
Yeah.
And he's sort of got happy with his judgment as a result of it. The other thing, of course, she's left with, though, is what he says about if Elton is your man.
Yeah.
I mean, that must have really thrown her.
Well, it actually says he had frightened her a little about Mr. Elton. She actually has to talk herself back into it. She's not so 100% I'm right all the time, I'm not going to listen to anything else. He does make her reflect. Her reflections are wrong, but she does think about it. And this is something, when I had my mental picture of Emma before starting this reread, I'd forgotten these moments of doubting her judgment.
Yes.
This chapter, it starts out with the same sort of banter we've been seeing between them up till now. This really good relationship they have. They disagree in a friendly way, but it does turn into a full-on argument.
Yes.
An argument that...
Oh, well, about something that's absolutely real.
Yes, about something that matters. And it's an argument that the fallout lasts for quite a few chapters. They don't actually make up until John and Isabella have arrived and Emma is determined they will make up. So it's an interesting shift the way that chapter starts one way and finishes another way.
It's still, though, my feeling with that chapter is, as far as I'm concerned, that's where I have established myself as pro Mr. Knightley.
Yeah.
I sort of trust him as this committed person for the neighbourhood.
That's actually something in the introduction to my Penguin edition from the 1980s. One thing I really liked about it, it said we see everything through Emma's eyes, but we judge everything by Mr. Knightley's standards. Which I thought was a great comparison to make, because I think it's true, and that's what you get in this chapter. Okay, then chapter 9 is mostly about Harriet's riddle book. Jane Austen is kind of scornful of this riddle book activity. She does seem to feel it's about Harriet's intellectual level.
It's her intellectual level, and she's sort of critical of Emma because Emma is prepared to substitute this. She ought to be sitting there reading some sensible books like The Vicar of Wakefield or recent Walter Scott poems, but no, they're fiddling through.
Yeah. It says in this chapter, her views of improving her little friend's mind by a great deal of useful reading and conversation had never yet led to more than a few first chapters and the intention of going on tomorrow.
With this chapter, we get this lovely picture of how Emma and Mr. Woodhouse interact.
Yeah. We see this lovely way that Mr. Woodhouse's mind just flits from one idea to the other because he's saying how this poem made him think of Isabella And that makes him think of Isabella and John's pending visit. And then we have that little conversation with Emma where he asks, have you thought where we're going to put them? And she says, of course they'll have the room they always have.
Yeah.
We talked about the riddle book being Harriet's intellectual level. Well, it also says that Mr. Woodhouse was almost as much interested in the business as the girls and tried very often to recollect something worth their putting in. It's his intellectual level as well.
Or not quite, because can he ever guess them? But he loves having them explained.
Yes, he loves the cleverness of them, but he can't work them out himself.
Yes. Are we going to talk now about Kitty a Fairbit Frozen Maid?
The thing with Kitty a Fairbit Frozen Maid is the footnotes in both my Cambridge edition and also the more recent Oxford World's Classics say there's a sexual double entendre in this, completely missed by Mr. Woodhouse, which seems to be generally accepted, sometimes taken even further. But there's recently been a really interesting article by Lona Manning, published in Persuasions, the online journal of Jasna, in which she says, as far as she can tell, there was no reference to it having sexual connotations any earlier than 1975. And she puts forward some really, really good arguments as to why you shouldn't see this as being read with sexual connotations. I will put a link to Lona's article and also to some blog posts that expand on it because it's really worth reading.
And I go along with it. We both go along with it.
Yes. So the only other bit we really get in this chapter is right at the end of the chapter, Mr. Elton calls, and we get, again, Emma's view of Mr. Elton, which is that with all his good and agreeable qualities, there was a sort of parade in his speeches which was very apt to incline her to laugh.
What we're gradually, I think, starting to happen, particularly in this chapter, is we've always had some sort of suspicions of Mr. Elton's absolute gentility. I think one of the interesting things we can see, though, is if we're looking at the way Emma, her analysis of how the social order is organised, she's drawing certain lines.
Yeah.
And we're going to find out that she's misinterpreting the way other people interpret them. She thinks there is a social line that goes below her and Mr. Knightley. But on the other side of that line, you find Mr. Elton, and Harriet belongs in that stratum.
Yeah.
And below that, there's a stratum which has farmers.
Yeah.
Whereas Mr. Elton draws a line which has Mr. Knightley, Emma, and him above a line.
Yeah.
And below that line is Harriet and the farmers.
To be fair to Mr. Elton, I think he probably does see a line between him and Emma, but he thinks that that is a line that Emma is willing to blur. Whereas
Yes.
he also sees a line between him and Harriet, and there's no way he is going to blur that line.
He's got a vision of his social stratum,
Yeah.
and it's not country gentry, but he thinks whatever it is good.
Yeah. Which, of course, leads into chapter 10,
Yes.
which is where they visit the poor family and then go to the vicarage.
Yes. And I don't like that chapter much.
I'm not a big fan of it either.
This is where Jane Austen suddenly introduces this idea of Emma's concern for poverty, that she cares about it, but it's not at all well done.
Emma sort of pontificating on when we see these people with this suffering, it makes us reflect on ourselves. And
What I feel is that little piece suggests that Jane Austen wants us to admire Emma for her attitude. But really, when you read it just in that passage, it's a bit hard to see much difference in anything we're told about Emma's feelings than when we're told that Lady Catherine used to scold all her villagers into harmony and plenty.
yeah. But the two other things that happen in that chapter is, first of all, Emma and Harriet's discussion of Emma not wanting to get married. And she makes the point that unlike all of the Jane Austen heroines we've seen to date,
Yeah.
Emma doesn't need to get married.
But on the other hand, particularly after our discussion last time, which made me a lot more aware of Emma's commitment to her father than I've ever been, it's just one of the most admirable things about her, that she is determined never to leave her father, but she doesn't stand up as a noble heroine, I will never leave my father. She doesn't begin to say that.
It doesn't even feel like she's trying to convince herself. She is genuinely expressing what she feels.
Yes.
Because she has this level of commitment to her father that goes so deep, she's not even questioning it.
Yes.
And then, of course, the chapter finishes with them bumping into Mr. Elton. Emma, again, manipulating the situation, maybe not in quite such a masterly way as she manipulated Harriet to refuse Mr. Martin, but still, mucking around with her bootlace so they go on ahead, and then breaking her bootlace so they go into the vicarage, and then leaving them in a room together.
Yeah.
How did Mr. Elton not notice that?
Yeah,
she's being blind to him, but he's also, in this scene, I think, being pretty blind to her.
Yeah, he's probably convinced himself.
Yeah. So in terms of favourite sentences, as usual, there were a lot I could choose from, but the one I've picked on, it's about Harriet's riddle book. It's a narrator comment. In this age of literature, such collections on a very grand scale are not uncommon. And I just love the fact that she's starting by saying in this age of literature, she leaves us in no doubt as to where she thinks the riddle book stands.
Oh, well, that was a lovely short one. I've got a long, long, long one. I've chosen it because I just think it so movingly describes Emma's way of living with her father. They've just received Mr. Elton's riddle. She read it to him just as he liked to have anything read, slowly and distinctly, and 2 or 3 times over, with explanations of every part as they proceeded. And he was very much pleased and, as she had foreseen, especially struck with the complimentary conclusion.
This is one of the paragraphs that I, on previous readings, hadn't really paid that much attention to. But after our discussion last week about Emma as the caregiver to Mr. Woodhouse and what she does for him, this really stood out to me as it's just the kind of thing Emma does without even thinking about it. She just instinctively, she knows what he needs and she gives it to him, and she does it so well. He is able to take this innocent joy out of it because she has explained it to him.
Which is, of course, largely what people do with children.
Yeah.
She's treating him as though he's a long-term child.
Yes. After a little bit of toing and froing, we've decided that this week we're going to be talking about the Martin family. And one interesting thing about the Martin family, it's a point made by John Mullen in his book, is that none of them actually speak in the course of the novel. So we never hear Robert Martin in his own words.
Most of the time, we hear Robert Martin through Emma's interpretation of what Harriet says.
I guess so what we get with Emma, aside from the fact that she's already prejudiced against him, she forms this negative opinion from how he looks and how he talks. But then when she reads the letter, she's unwillingly impressed by it.
Yes.
And then when Harriet comes running to tell her about the encounter she's had with Mr. Martin and with Elizabeth in Ford's, Emma is again reluctantly quite impressed. So she's had this prejudice against him, but she's kind of having to revisit it.
Or perhaps not so much she has a prejudice, she has a stereotype of what a young farmer is like.
Yes.
She thinks he must be like that.
And that first meeting endorsed that because of his clothes or his accent
or his
or
demeanour, his appearance and his demeanour, yes. But then on the other side, what you've got is all this information about him having at least an educated mind.
Yes.
He can write really well. He reads the Agricultural Review.
Which Emma is a bit sniffy about, but I mean, that's his professional journal.
I mean, that was what told you the very latest stuff in farming. What it means is he's possibly more educated than some of the farmers Knightley isn't so happy with.
Yeah.
They're probably stuck in the old ways, where he's doing sheep farming like Mr. Knightley. They're both very keen on sheep farming.
Yeah.
He's really up to the minute, but he isn't, in fact, just up with the Agricultural Journal, because he has read The Vicar of Wakefield, and that means he's obviously been putting himself through sort of the basic general reading that an educated person has, only hasn't read The Romance of the Forest. Emma tries to pretend to Harriet that he should have tried to get hold of it.
Emma is basically saying if he really cared for you, he would have got hold of that. But we have ample evidence. You know, he went off and got her walnuts. He got someone to come and sing for her. But then also, and I think this is so nice, when they meet at Ford's, he and Elizabeth, they're obviously hurt and offended, or you'd expect they're hurt and offended, but they are behaving in a very, very dignified manner. But then when Harriet's leaving, he runs after her and tells her not to take the main road because it's flooded, to take the other road. And that actually made me think in Persuasion of how Captain Wentworth takes the small child off Anne's back.
Yes.
And then he arranges for her to get the ride back with the crops because he can see she's tired. And Anne can see that what it is that even though she's hurt him unforgivably, he will still notice.
Well, he's behaving in what she would regard normally as a gentlemanly manner. And of course, at one point, Mr. Knightley refers to him as a gentleman farmer.
Yes.
And that then, in a sense, puts him into a particular kind of farmer, not just the ones who are trying to make the best money by following the latest agricultural ones. But it was a whole stratum of society that is trying to move up in the world. And gentleman farmer through the 19th century, became something that people liked to be called.
Yeah.
It meant they'd had some education. But you can see the same thing is happening with Mrs. Martin. Mrs. Martin is trying to turn her old farmhouse into something much more of a gentleman's residence. They've got 2 parlours. They've got a maid who's been with them for a long, long time, and they're going to get an indoor man.
And they've got a summer house.
They're turning this farmhouse closer and closer to a gentleman's residence. They just have these aspirations. And, of course, people were criticised for doing what the Martins are doing, which is sending their daughters to boarding schools, trying to make ladies of their daughters. And all this criticism of them comes out from the class above, like Emma, in fact, saying they're trying to catch up on us.
So I suppose if you're being uncharitable, like Emma is, you could see them as social climbing upstarts, but they're not just social climbing upstarts. They're behaving in this dignified manner. They are aspirational, which is not the same. They are, in a perfectly legitimate way, moving up the social strata. Whereas if you're looking for a social climbing upstart in Emma, I think Mrs. Elton is probably the better choice.
Yes. Mr. Martin is obviously starting to have this relation with the gentleman of Highbury. It's not just Mr. Knightley who's taking him up. This group of gentlemen who meet at the whist club.
Yeah.
He is obviously being asked to dinner by them.
Yeah.
And they're not turning their noses up at him. So they're moving up, even though he is obviously still a tenant farmer.
You really do have to admire Mr. Martin for his commitment to Harriet. He doesn't go off and sulk. He doesn't marry someone else in a fit of pique. As soon as he actually has the opportunity to properly connect with Harriet without Emma there running interference,
Yes.
he reestablishes the relationship really quickly, and then he proposes.
Yes. What one really worries about a bit is how good is Harriet going to be as a working farmer's wife?
I think she'll be okay because assuming Mrs. Martin Sr. lives for a number of years, Harriet is very suggestible and very trainable, and I think she can learn stuff. And I just think Mrs. Martin, she sounds like a beautiful motherly woman. She will
Train
Harriet up.
I suppose what I was comparing them with is Mrs. Poyser in Adam Bede, and it's set in the 1800s,
Yep.
And she is so busy and she does so much and she's such a good organiser. And I've tended to see Mrs. Martin like her, but I don't think she's quite as keen on the being a lady business. But obviously Mrs. Martin is. And if she thinks she wants Harriet for a daughter-in-law...
To be quite honest, she probably thinks her son could do better, but if he wants Harriet, she thinks he could also do worse, and she thinks she could train up Harriet. That is my personal picture of Mrs. Martin's view of Harriet. She doesn't dislike her. She doesn't see any harm in her. She just probably thinks he could have done better, but it's okay, like Mr. Knightley thinks.
At this point, I'd like to introduce the relationship between people like the Martins and the landowners like Mr. Knightley. I mean, they had their farms on leases, but I'm pretty sure from something I read that these leases were long-term. There'd often be accounts of 3 life leases, and those lives would be the current farmer, his wife, and his son. So at the time we're looking at, Mrs. Martin could well still be the owner of the farm. Years and years ago, I was doing research on women's employment in England in the 19th century, and I got involved in working out what proportion of women were in different occupations at what age. This is in 1851, but plenty of people who organised their leases as far back as the 1810s would still have been in the census. Well, when I compared butchers and bakers and farmers, among the 15 to 20-year-olds, of which there weren't many, only 5% of them were women. But gradually, as the age groups went on, the proportion of women got larger and larger. Mostly, I assumed, because you had men who died and their widows took over the business, and that proportion kept on increasing and increasing up till the women were in their 50s. And then after that, the percentage of butchers and bakers absolutely drops away.
And I can see from this graph that you're showing me, and I'll put a copy of it in the show notes, that the percentage of female farmers just keeps going up, just skyrocket.
These women are still probably leasing a farm.
With this graph, in 1851, Harriet Martin would be about 55.
Yes,
so
she's in the one that's going up, yes.
We get such a good picture of the Martins, even though they're so seldom in the book.
Yes, we're given just the right sort of information, and particularly, of course, for Jane Austen's first readers, who would have known that what you're looking is one of these aspirational farming families which are becoming more and more prosperous, and as they become more prosperous, they become more gentrified.
Yeah.
Today, I'm going to use this time on the historical background to look at 2 expressions that turn up in Emma, but not in any of the other novels: vicar and parish business, and try to work out what Jane Austen expected her readers to assume they meant. To turn first to the word vicar, always applied to Mr. Elton, but to no other Jane Austen clergyman. It's become customary today to refer, usually semi-humorously, to all Anglican priests who run parishes as the vicar. But in fact, in Jane Austen's day, the word had a precise meaning in the vocabulary of the Anglican Church. Whether or not the incumbent of a parish was a rector or a vicar depended on whether or not the tithes, that is, the annual payment of 1/10 of the produce of the parish, which by Jane Austen's time had usually been converted to a cash payment, were owed directly to him, that is, the incumbent, and were collected by him, or whether they passed through someone else's hands. If he collected them himself, he was the rector of the parish. If they were collected by someone else, and only a percentage passed on to him, he was a vicar, and the someone else was the rector. There's a clear explanation of this difference in an internet post by William Savage called The Georgian Clergy.
And I'll put a link in the show notes.
Right, good. Nevertheless, the vicar, though he didn't get all the money, had most of the obligations and benefits that went with being rector. The appointment was for life. He took possession of the parsonage, though it was known as the vicarage, not the rectory. Probably though I'm not sure of this. He had control of the glebe farm and the income it produced. In return, he was expected to perform all the pastoral and civic functions, and I'll get back to the civic function shortly, expected of a rector.
So if he's the vicar and the rector is collecting the tithes, where would the rector be in Emma?
Well, we're not told.
Okay.
In a great many cases, vicars were appointed by institutions that had the patronage of livings all round the place and wanted to keep the tithes of some of the livings for themselves. The most frequently mentioned of these institutions are university colleges, but I'm pretty sure I've encountered instances in novels where rectorships were held by town councils. There were also private individuals known as lay rectors who had acquired the right to collect the tithes and appoint a vicar. This was another of those stratagems by which members of the laity got their hands on money intended for the church. As far as I can see, Jane Austen gives no real hints on how Mr. Elton was appointed. She seems to be suggesting that his sponsor in the area was Mr. Cole. He was first seen arm in arm with Mr. Cole in the town. It's Mr. Cole he notifies when he's going to London, to Bath, or to be married. Could Mr. Cole have bought the lay rectorship of Highbury as part of his social climbing plan and appointed Mr. Elton, perhaps already a friend, to be his support in parish politics?
I guess that really depends on how much world building we think Jane Austen did in her head versus how much made it through to the book. Because obviously she felt it wasn't important to the story, or
Yes.
she would have made it clear. So had she decided in her head that that was his background, or is it just we're trying to speculate based on things that she really hadn't thought about?
Yes, that's what I'm going on to say. If this had been the case, surely Mrs. Elton, once she's married, would have been cozying up to the Coles and not doing what she does, which is claiming her husband has this unique connection with Mr. Knightley. Perhaps rather all Jane Austen wanted to do was to show, as some critics have argued, how a stable society is disrupted by a series of newcomers, and that Mr. Elton was wished on Highbury by some unspecified outside body, which goes along with what you were saying.
Yeah. I guess you could also think another reason to make him a vicar rather than a rector is that if he was a rector, then presumably Mr. Knightley would have had the presentation of the living, and therefore you would have had Mr. Knightley being responsible for choosing Mr. Elton. And we don't want to think Mr. Knightley would make such a terrible choice.
Yes. To turn now to the question of parish business. In Emma, we are for the first time in Jane Austen introduced to the all-male society of her world. We learn very early on that there is a whist club established among the gentlemen and half-gentlemen of the town that meets regularly at the Crown Hotel, and that Mr. Elton is welcomed into it. But we also learn that members of this same group are frequently in contact about something called parish business. Mr. Knightley tells Emma, "I had a few lines on parish business from Mr. Weston this morning," and at the dinner at the Coles, Frank, when he comes to join the ladies in the drawing room, tells Emma his father, Mr. Knightley, Mr. Cox and Mr. Cole were very busy over parish business. Mr. Elton seems also to be part of this otherwise secular group. At one point Mrs. Elton boasts, "Oh no, it's a meeting at the Crown, a regular meeting. Weston and Cole will be there too, but one is apt to speak only of those who lead. I fancy Mr. Ian Knightley have everything their own way."
Classic Mrs. Elton, that line.
And also a reason for feeling that somehow the Coles couldn't really have appointed him, even though he's obviously such buddies with Mr. Cole. This seems to me, though I could be wrong, to be a meeting of the parish council. which, unlike the whist club, was official, legally established, the lowest level of the government of the country. In Jane Austen's time, the parish was not just an ecclesiastical division, but it was the lowest level of civil government. It was controlled by a parish council that was responsible for keeping order in the village or town and keeping it clean, which meant being able to hire such officials as constables, night watchmen and scavengers, and tax the residents for the purpose. The parish council had not, however, been established for this purpose. It was originally the body that cared for the upkeep of the church and paid the salaries of the church officers like the sexton and the parish clerk.
Mm-hmm.
And it had historically been entitled to impose a church rate on the better off parishioners.
Mm-hmm.
And it was these parishioners who elected the parish council. This council was summoned and chaired by the local clergyman and usually met in the vestry.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, parish councils all over the country began to undertake civic services that had nothing to do with the church and pay for them by increasing the church rates. And this would seem to provide a context for Mrs. Elton's picture of her husband's working life, being pestered by magistrates and overseers and church wardens, always wanting his opinion. It was not until the 1830s that these activities began to be disentangled by parliamentary legislation. I can't help wondering what it was that prompted Jane Austen to move her fictional scene from a society of country houses and parsonages where the women discussed the local assemblies and the men very much off-scene, hunting and shooting, to one dominated by whist and parish business. And I can't help relating it to something hypothesised by Penny Gay in her article in Persuasions, that Jane Austen was using the town of Alton, only 20 minutes' walk from Chawton, as a model for Highbury. Jane Austen had placed her early novels in the society of country houses and rectories she had grown up in at Steventon. Having moved to Chawton, she found the society that centred on a country town, and one where the clergyman was a vicar and not a rector, rather different, and chose to explore that difference in Emma.
As I said in the last episode, because there have been so many different versions of Emma, rather than trying to cover all of them each episode on the chapters we've covered, I'm going to do one version per episode. So for this episode, I'm talking about the 1996 Miramax cinema release version of Emma. 1995 was a big year for Jane Austen.
Yeah.
We had Pride and Prejudice, we had Sense and Sensibility, we had Persuasion, and we also had Clueless, which is the modernisation of Emma that I'm going to be talking about later.
Yeah.
And then in 1996, we had both this Miramax movie and also an ITV telemovie. So the 1996 Miramax one, it starred Gwyneth Paltrow as Emma. She was 24 at the time. And then Mr. Knightley is played by Jeremy Northam, who was 35 at the time. But because Jeremy Northam is good looking and quite young looking, and of course at 24 Gwyneth Paltrow doesn't look 20, so the age difference between them was less apparent. He's a bit more obvious as a potential romantic partner right from the start than maybe he's meant to be. Frank Churchill was played by Ewan McGregor. He was 25 at the time. This was his first role after being in Trainspotting, and I think I read somewhere that his agent wanted him to take it as a contrast to his role in Trainspotting.
All right.
Harriet Smith was played by Australian actress Toni Collette, who was 24.
Yes.
And Jane Fairfax by Polly Walker, who was 30. Miss Bates is played by Sophie Thompson, Emma Thompson's sister, who was technically a bit too young. She also in 1995 played Mary Musgrove. Mrs. Bates is played by Phyllida Law, who is Sophie and Emma Thompson's mother.
All right.
But something I read said this was actually almost coincidental because it was two different casting agencies managing those parts.
Yes.
I only saw this production at the cinema at the time. My memory of it was that I didn't particularly like it, and in particular that I really didn't like Gwyneth Paltrow's Emma and Toni Collette's Harriet. On revisiting it, I still have some issues, but I found I was a lot more amenable to their performances than I had been before. I didn't dislike Gwyneth Paltrow's performance. I didn't love it. I felt it was okay, but I still felt what I had felt at the time, that nothing about it made me warm to the character of Emma or made me see anything in Emma that I hadn't got from the book. My memory of Toni Collette as Harriet Smith was really negative. I had this strong memory of her being awkward and clumsy and a bit gormless and nothing like I pictured Harriet.
Yeah.
But the clumsiness, in fact, that I remembered as being a fundamental part of her character was really only in one scene. But if I take that scene out, I still don't think she's as good as the 1972 Harriet, but I do think Toni Collette is an excellent actress, and I think she gives the performance she was being asked to give. I just felt it wasn't quite how I see Harriet. Now, the two other characters I wanted to talk about were Mr. Woodhouse, who I found quite disappointing, because he seemed to be a bit more grumpy than fussy. He seemed quite hale and hearty in spite of talking about his health, and we didn't get any sense of his neediness. And the last one is Miss Bates. Now, Sophie Thompson is great. She's a wonderful comic actress, but I think because of that, they made Miss Bates a more consciously comic character. I think in this one, you were meant to laugh out loud at her, whereas in 1972, you were meant to be amused.
Yes.
So, a couple of things that really struck me about this production. Most conversations were happening when people were doing things. And I guess this is probably a way of differentiating itself from BBC series and things where there's lots of people sitting in the drawing room and talking.
Yes.
So you have Emma and Harriet walking outdoors through lovely countryside. They're walking beside a creek. They're walking along this country lane. They're in an apple orchard. They're in the street of Highbury. There's one where they're sitting in this sort of tent thing on the lawn doing embroidery. There's a scene between Emma and Mr. Elton where they're, I think, arranging the Harvest Festival decorations in the church. But the most extreme case of this is when Emma and Mr. Knightley are having their conversation about Mr. Martin proposing and Emma convincing Harriet to say no. They're on the lawn doing archery. I remembered that as being one of the things that I disliked at the time. This time round, it did sort of work quite well for the conversation. Now, because this is slightly under 2-hour movie, it doesn't have the capacity to cover the whole plot that the miniseries approach does.
Yes.
So, of course, they have to make some cuts. And what I think really suffers in this adaptation is the Jane and Frank storyline.
All right.
It's there, but it is really truncated and you just don't get a picture of it. From a pure plot perspective, there's no scene of Frank saying he's going to London to get a haircut. And I've got to say, if there was ever a Frank Churchill who needed a haircut, it was this one. Because his hair is awful. So I don't think we ever find out that it was Frank Churchill that sent the piano. They don't have the alphabet game. So there's another scene later on where he says to Emma, we must say the word Dixon in front of Jane, but it never happens. And there's a party and Emma is singing and Frank gets up unprompted and joins in with a duet. And you have a shot of Jane in the audience looking kind of unhappy. And then when it finishes, Emma is sitting down and Frank goes back to the piano to sing a duet with Jane. He did this with Emma so he could sing with Jane. But you don't get the full build-up of this story. It's truncated to the point of being almost an afterthought. It's so secondary to the plot. They had to make cuts, and I can see that there is a sense in cutting that right back, but I do think it's a shame.
Yes. What did they do with Emma's blunders? Did they allow the audience to know from the beginning she was wrong?
They let the audience work it out when it comes to Mr. Elton. They gave you little hints with Frank and Jane, but like I said, that story was so truncated that you weren't that engaged by it, and therefore you didn't get any strong sense of surprise.
But what about the Harriet, Mr. Knightley?
Well, they emphasised more strongly that it was Frank, because when Frank is saving Harriet, there was a close-up of his hand grasping hers. And it felt very, this is important.
Yes.
You thought exactly the same thing that Emma thought.
Yes.
Now, just some random differences from the book. When Harriet is on her walk and Frank saves her, she's actually walking with Emma, not with a schoolmate.
Yes.
And when this started, I was thinking, but Emma's not going to run away like the schoolmate did. And she doesn't. But Harriet is actually being physically assaulted. She's on the ground with people around her before Frank comes to save her. It makes it a more serious attack than it was in the book, I think.
Yes.
In 1972, they went strawberry picking in the morning and then to Box Hill in the afternoon. In this one, it's actually all the one thing. There's this cut from the immediate post-attack when Harriet is recovering in Emma's house. It then cuts to the strawberry picking. And
Yeah.
then you're on Box Hill. And I thought, oh, again, it must be the same day. But then it turned out that it's all one thing because Mrs. Elton says, I'm going to go and get more strawberries. So they're obviously having a picnic in a place with a view, but that's also where the strawberries were. Nothing is said about where it is. In the 1972 version, day after Box Hill, when Emma goes to visit the Bateses and Jane goes out of the room because she's not feeling well, Emma explicitly apologises to Miss Bates.
Yes.
In this one, Emma is arriving and Miss Bates and Jane rush out of the room and Miss Bates does not come back.
Yes.
Which is, I guess, bringing it home even more strongly to Emma that she has done the wrong thing.
But doesn't fit very well with the Miss Bates of the book.
No. I would be very surprised if there is a version of this where you don't feel for Miss Bates at Box Hill. And
Yes.
you do. Sophie Thompson, really delivered that hurt.
Yes.
But having it carry over to the next day, I guess I can see why they did it. And of course, they don't have to stick exactly to the book, but it wasn't one I particularly liked. I'm just going to finish with some what on earth were they thinking moments. It struck me as very odd and inappropriate that Harriet shows Emma the letter from Mr. Martin while they're walking down the streets of Highbury. And they're having that conversation there. They clearly wanted to have all these walking and talking scenes, but that should not have been a walking and talking scene, and it should not have been an out in public scene. That should have been a drawing room scene, I thought.
Yes.
Emma, on a couple of occasions, is driving this little... It's sort of more than a pony trap, but less than a carriage. She's driving it herself, which, okay, whatever. But she comes to the stream and she drives it across the stream on what may or may not be an official ford, and she gets stuck in the middle, and Frank Churchill turns up, and this is our introduction to Frank Churchill, and he helps her get unstuck and out of the stream. And I just thought Emma would not just try and ford the stream unless she knew it was completely safe. She's lived there all her life. It was just silly, I thought.
Yeah.
And the last thing that I thought was really silly is at the strawberry picking / Box Hill, when they're having their sandwiches, Mrs. Elton makes a comment about having made the sandwiches herself. And I just thought,
Yes.
no.
Even if she had, she wouldn't have told them.
No. So, like I said, I hadn't seen this since it first came out. My memory of it was not particularly positive. This time round, I did enjoy it more than I remembered. It still had things I didn't like. I thought it was generally okay. Nothing was quite as terrible as I remembered. But what it didn't do at the time, and I feel still didn't do now, was it didn't make me get Emma. I thought at the time, I still don't like Emma. I still don't see what it is I'm meant to like about Emma from this film.
Yes.
And I kind of went into it when I first saw it, hoping that it would make me get Emma, and it didn't. Since we did the last episode, there's been a few comments on our Facebook page and also on our website. So thank you very much to everyone who commented. I have tried to respond to all of you, but there are just one or two I thought we'd also like to mention here and jointly respond to. Fee has commented, "One thing I ask, tell Emma off when she needs it, yes, but cut her some slack too. Yes, she's awful to Miss Bates, but are any of us so perfect that we might not snap after years of Batesisms in such a small circle company?" Well, yes, I think we're both finding that up until this read-through, we were telling Emma off all the time and really not cutting her as much slack as maybe we should have done. Because I am definitely, this time through, finding that, yes, I can see where Emma is coming from a lot of the time. And yes, she still needs telling off, but not as much as maybe I always thought.
Actually, I'm getting fond of her because I'm seeing her as sillier than I ever thought her before.
Then we had another comment from Cheryl Ann Gansey. A thought about Mr. Woodhouse's mental health. He may be experiencing the trauma of unresolved complex grief. If we consider that his backstory may have a deceased mother, child's grief, add his own wife's death, spousal grief, the death of Mr. Weston's first wife, local community grief, and the overall cultural grief of mothers dying during childbirth, it is possible to consider his anxiety, fears, and preoccupation with health as a form of PTSD, which has a mental confusion component. Just at the time Cheryl Ann made that comment, I had been watching the 2009 adaptation of Emma, and they positioned Mr. Woodhouse as someone who was always a bit nervous but was profoundly affected by his wife's early death. So I do think that is an interpretation that, again, they made up characters, they didn't really exist, but I think you could very legitimately say that is a part of why Mr. Woodhouse is the way he is.
Yes.
Lona Manning has commented on Mr. Woodhouse, the references to him that I've come across in 19th and early 20th century literature refer to him as Dear Mr. Woodhouse. He's an endearing old duffer, which of course fits in with the way G.B. Stern talks about him when she refers to him as her favourite chump in the series.
Yes.
But Lona also gave a link to an article called The Hidden Horror Inside Jane Austen's Novels of Love, which I read, and it was very interesting, though I do need to go back and read it a lot more carefully. It doesn't just talk about Mr. Woodhouse, it talks about a lot of aspects of Jane Austen's novels. But I think it does articulate much better than I did in our last episode that there is this potential to view Mr. Woodhouse in a very negative light, as a leech on Emma, as a controlling influence because of his weakness. And I don't think it's even an invalid reading, because it's undeniable he is constraining Emma. But the thing I see is that he is genuinely needy, and the world is full of genuinely needy people, and the world is also full of people who care for those genuinely needy people, some of them as family caregivers, some of them as professional caregivers. But I don't think it's just a hidden horror inside Jane Austen's novels. I think it's part of the world we live in.
It's just an aspect of what Jane Austen was capable of doing, about revealing parts of her world that are still with us and that previous novelists had ever thought of touching on.
Joyce Wong also commented on our discussion of the impact of Mr. Woodhouse on Emma, and said that it makes Emma sound much more rounded and makes me understand the manipulation aspect of her character a bit better. If she has no control over what is happening to her father, then she takes that need to control in other directions. And if her father really was mentally declining, then that makes him a much more sympathetic character rather than the manipulator which I previously thought of him as being.
That's interesting that she feels that he was manipulating. I mean, I felt he was a terrible drag, but I didn't feel he was choosing what he was going to stop Emma doing.
Yeah.
He just responded spontaneously.
Yeah. Based on his own needs.
Completely on, his own views.
Yeah. And Joyce finishes by saying, I absolutely love the 1970s adaptation. That Harriet actress is my favourite, and we should have a drinking game with a shot taken every time she says Miss Woodhouse. Bethany makes the point, you said during the episode that Mrs. Churchill oppresses Frank, but I think we have little evidence of that. Unlike Emma, Frank travels almost constantly. While Mr. Weston blames Mrs. Churchill for Frank not visiting, Frank confesses himself that it was Jane who really kept him away. If anything, Mr. Woodhouse versus Mrs. Churchill shows how charitable the town is to the man in front of them and how nasty they are to the exact same person when they are far away. That is so true. I was guilty of taking as read what people told me about Mrs. Churchill, and Mr. Weston in particular has a vested interest in blaming Mrs. Churchill rather than blaming Frank. So yes.
Whereas Mr. Knightley sees through that defence.
Yeah. After reading Bethany's comment and thinking about it, I don't entirely discount Mrs. Churchill exerting control over Frank, but I do think, yes, I need to take with a grain of salt the extent to which we are told it happens.
Well, also, we know you can't trust a word Frank Churchill says.
Yeah, there's that too.
I mean, sometimes he tells the truth, but how do you know?
Yeah. So, again, thank you everyone for all your lovely comments. We really appreciate them. I'm sorry we can't read them all out, and I do try to respond to all of them, but I'm afraid there have been some I've missed, and I do apologise for that. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be looking at chapters 11 to 15 of Emma.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and our website readingjaneausten.com.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.